As I said last week, it's time to talk about money. So we're in the middle of a 3-week series called Plain Talk about money, culture, and faith. We're dealing with the questions, how do you think about money and our stuff? We're looking at 3 critical questions. Last week, the question was, to whom does our money and our stuff belong? We said, well, our culture, on the one hand, tells us that it's all ours. And our goal in life is to be consumers of it all. We also learned that our faith tells us that it all belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's. And we're to be caretakers. The goal in our life is to be stewards of all that belongs to God and to use it wisely. That's what we talked about last week. This week, the question is, how much money and stuff is enough? And we'll get to that in just a bit. Next week, the question is, how do we show in practical ways with our money and our stuff that God is Lord of our lives? These are 3 critical questions that help us think about generosity and stewardship in the life of the church. So, let's dig into our second question. How much money and stuff is enough? Well, as you were looking at that title, you probably thought in several different directions, and I have too. One direction is how much money and stuff is enough for us to give away? Well, that's next week. This week is how much money is enough for us to live on and be content? That's the question for this week. And just to start out with a drastic comparison, did you know that almost half of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day? How much is enough? Our culture's story is that our happiness, our contentment, depends on our outward circumstances, on our visible achievements, on our material comforts, on our money and stuff. Our culture tells us that your appetites need to be satisfied. I don't need to rehearse the stories of those who are very well off, whose lives have fallen apart because their money and their stuff didn't make them happy or keep them satisfied or bring them contentment. We all know those stories that are out there. Our culture tells us happiness depends on our outward circumstances. Our faith story is that it is our inner circumstances that determines our happiness, our contentment, our inner circumstances. We've talked a lot over the last several years about 5 practices, and the author of that concept is Bishop Robert Schnase, a United Methodist bishop. And in his book, The 5 Practices of Faithful Living, which made it individualized, he says this. He says, generosity derives from a profound reorientation in our thinking about how we find contentment in our life. And that's what our message is about today. That profound reorientation between what our culture tells us and what our faith tells us about where we find contentment in life. George read what the Apostle Paul said, I've learned to be content with whatever I have. Paul realized how seductive culture is. Paul realized how his appetites drove him to more and more, but he learned to be content with whatever he had. And that's where we have to start as well, realizing how seductive our culture is and how our culture feeds our natural sinful appetites. The writer to the Hebrews was familiar with the panic that sets in to pursue great wealth, to live in fine houses, to get more and more possessions and more than the rest of the world. He also knew that persons who do that still feel empty and isolated and fearful. Thus he says, don't be sucked in by the love of money. Be content with whatever you have and use it wisely. Friends, when we base our self-worth on our salary or on the neighborhood in which we live or what type of car we drive, then we're always striving for more. We're like fish surrounded by water, but dying of thirst. When we base our sense of self-worth on our feelings of scarcity, then we're hooked by our appetites and driven by our culture. When we base our sense of self-worth on our feelings of what we lack rather than what we do have, then the battle is lost. What will it take for us, like Paul, to learn how to become more content? I'm going to have us look at what I'm calling 4 lessons on the journey toward contentment. I'm going to put up those 4, and then we'll go through each one as we go along. The 4 lessons start with, number 1, break the cycle of conditioned discontent. Give thanks in all things is number 2. Realize, thirdly, that God has provided all we need to flourish. And the last lesson is we need to learn to develop anti-consumerist practices. So let's spend some time in detail in each one of those areas. What does it mean to break the cycle of conditioned discontent? Well, as I said, our culture story is that it's our outward circumstances. In other words, our discontent is conditioned by the surroundings in which we live. What do we need to do to break the cycle of conditioned discontent, which is happiness is caused by our outward circumstances? Well, our faith tells us that our happiness is indeed determined by our inner circumstances. And there are 4 kinds of inner circumstances that I'd like us to think about this morning that help us break this cycle.